Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wharton Tech Talks. I'm Spandana,
And I'm Jordan.
and we're the co hosts for Wharton Tech Talks. Today, we're joined by Jay Clayton. Jay served as the chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission from 2017 through 2020, where he focused on modernizing the regulation and oversight of equity and fixed income markets. Jay is currently a senior policy advisor and of counsel to Sullivan and Cromwell. He is also the non executive chair and lead independent director of Apollo Global Management, and he serves on the board of American Express, among other institutions. And he's also an adjunct professor at both the Wharton School and the Carey Law School at the University of Pennsylvania. Jay is also a Penn alum, having earned his bachelor's in engineering as an undergrad and his JD from the University of Pennsylvania. Jay, we're so excited to host you on our podcast. Where are you calling us from?
Spendana, I'm actually at meetings down in Florida today, which is kind of nice. It's a little warmer here. And Jordan, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I think we're enjoying some of the warm weather here today, too.
Yeah, spring on the Penn
Yeah,
campus is pretty
definitely.
nice, even if it comes early.
For sure, for sure. So, getting started, as Spandana alluded to, you've enjoyed a wide ranging career in both the private and public sphere, from your time in corporate law to serving as the chairman of the SEC. So, before we kick things off, could you just give an overview of how your experience has intersected with the tech sector and particularly with cryptocurrency?
Sure. I'll give it a try. I think my initial experience with the tech sector goes back to my days at Penn. I was an undergrad and engineer in the 80s, graduating in 1988. And that was just as tech in the US was starting to take off. And you make choices at the time. And I chose to actually go into the financial and legal world, first going off and getting a master's in economics or a second BA at Cambridge. They then call it a master's. We can call it whatever we want, but it was some economic training and then back to Penn. Then when I became a lawyer, some of the transactions that I worked on were tech oriented. And I enjoyed that because I could see a decade later, 15 years later, the people who were my contemporaries, then people who had come along much later, really changing the world. The amount being in tech is about being in the future. And it's really neat to see that, even if you're only working on the financing and corporate structuring side.
That's really exciting. And I think we definitely agree that tech is such an interesting area to be in and certainly very exciting as we look toward the future. We know that you've been an outspoken advocate for greater regulation of crypto markets specifically within tech and sort of at that intersection of law, business, tech industry. Could you maybe briefly take us through what your vision of regulation in the space would look like?
Well, I think we have to take a step back and realize that crypto is a technology. And in the parlance that we use it, it's also a term that covers a wide spectrum of applications. So crypto technology can apply to traditional financial instruments, new financial instruments, other functions that we currently use what I would say is existing technology for, including tokenizing. For example, let me give you a great example of where crypto technology makes a ton of sense. When you have a mortgage and you have title insurance and you have to do all of these paper filings and it costs a whole lot of money and a whole lot of time, all of that could be reduced to a very simple transaction on a immutable distributed ledger, saving people across the economy hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. Okay. That's one application of the technology. Another application of the technology is a representation of a traditional equity security. In each of those cases, there are existing regulations. Some of them are hard to comply with, but what we're not going to do is we're not going to let the introduction of the new technology get rid of those existing regulations, or at least the purpose of those existing regulations. So people say, hey, Jay, you're for greater regulation. No, that's not the case. I'm actually for crypto technology doing the existing regulatory job at least as well. And if you do the existing regulatory job at least as well, and you capture a whole bunch of efficiencies, you're still going to do very well.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I know in previous interviews that I've seen you and you've talked a lot about these opportunities to tackle like frictions and inefficiencies that exist within both the domestic and the global financial system. So I'm interested to hear, based on your experience and the evolution of the landscape that you're seeing today, I know you mentioned a couple examples, but I'm curious, where do you really see the areas of greatest opportunity, or what are you most optimistic about in terms of applications for crypto technology?
So let's go with two things. I'm very optimistic that crypto technology can take clunky transactions and make them more efficient. Like I talked about the title insurance, mortgage market, for the lawyers who listen to this or people who do secured financing, all of the UCC filings you do, all of those heavily paper intensive transactions where it could easily be replaced. So that actually applies to what I would say are traditional securities. So, for example, mortgage-backed securities, very complicated. A lot flows through what I would say is traditional analog processes, 1980s technology and the like. Fairly easy, you would think, to sort of mete out those efficiencies. And I think there's a lot of promise there. There's also, anytime there's a new technology, you can expand, I think, off existing products and create new products. So, for example, I think stablecoin is a new product that expands off the idea of sort of what I would say is money transfer and does it in an incredibly efficient way. So I'm a big advocate for rules that clearly delineate when a stablecoin can function as a money transfer mechanism and is stable enough, which means it's as stable as the money transfer system, like by analogy, that we can go forward. So there's two examples. And I think there are a lot more, including affinity groups, things like you can see things like airline miles being tokenized, all of those kinds of things that tie people together in a network.
No, thanks for the additional color there. And, having taken a class with you last semester, I know one of the things we talked a lot about in class was the somewhat unique nature of crypto among financial innovations in terms of it's actually being offered directly to retail customers rather than through intermediaries. And we talked a lot about, what are the additional implications of that. But I'm wondering if you could share for our listeners, in your view, how does this impact the way that you think about regulation and enforcing regulation in the crypto space?
Sure. And you make a terrific point, which is regulation is not just about the rules, but it's at how do you apply the rules in the most effective way. And in financial regulation, what I often say is you don't sit next to an investor. You don't sit next to a consumer of financial products. You regulate the person who provides it to the investor or provides it to the consumer. And that's how you make sure that the presentation to the consumer or the investor is fair and allows them to make a fair choice. With crypto, it came on the scene and unregulated entities went directly to investors and consumers. So you missed out on that regulatory focal point. And that's one of the challenges in dealing with the existing crypto landscape, in that you don't have that identified regulated focal point in order to implement your regulation.
No, I think that's very valid. And, just talking about the regulatory focal point, I think that's come into broader and mainstream discussion now, especially with the collapse of FTX that happened last year. And I'm curious, even before that, I remember you were still talking about some of these topics around having an additional layer of regulation, but obviously now it's more top of mind. How did the FTX collapse influence the way, if at all, in the way that you thought about crypto regulation? Or are there any changes that we need to urgently act on as a result of that we weren't talking about necessarily before?
Let me say that, whether it was FTX or it was another entity, and there are other entities you can point to, there are some common themes that many of us, not just me, have been saying since 2016, 2017, 2018, coming on the scene, which is when you have financial products that are being traded on what looks like an exchange, something that looks similar to the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, there are some basic rules that need to be in place in order for you to be comfortable that the price isn't being manipulated and that there's not what I would say is excess leverage or systemic risk. And what we saw in FTX and what we saw in those things was exactly that. There are a suite of basic rules that all platforms, exchanges have implemented for, I'll say, decades, even centuries. You don't commingle customer funds. You have segregation. You limit leverage. You don't allow for what I would say is the age-old types of fraudulent trading, wash sales, laddering, those types of things. All of that, if it's absent, there's going to be a problem. And it was absent, and there was a problem. What's fascinating about some of this is that, and you can name your Three Arrows, others, or whatever, most of the problems were not on the blockchain. Most of the problems were in what I would call, for lack of a better term, spreadsheet type systems that you didn't have the type of immutability, certainty that the blockchain is supposed to bring to these types of technologies. So the commingling wasn't occurring on the blockchain and that type of thing. So let's remember that when you say crypto was the problem, I'm not sure crypto was the problem. Age-old lessons that were ignored, that was the problem.
Yeah, I think that I remember reading somewhere that you talked about also it being a liquidity problem primarily, right? And that's also been the main narrative. Maybe for our listeners who are less familiar, do you mind walking through in your mind what, given that it wasn't really a problem with the blockchain, what were some other issues that really went wrong?
Well, we talked about exchanges and what can go wrong on exchanges and platforms when you access customer funds and you don't have what I would call is rules around trading and making sure that people aren't on both sides of the trade. I think what you're talking about is another problem that was obvious, which is that when you borrow short term and you invest long term, you have a liquidity mismatch. And some of the other failures we've seen in crypto are the result of exactly that. An inability to access liquidity from your longer term investments when your shorter term obligations are coming due. And we spend a great deal of time regulating broker dealers, banks, and other financial intermediaries to ensure that that type of liquidity mismatch, which is part of investing, you can't eliminate it, but that it's managed in a responsible way so that you do not have runs on banks, that you do not have customer assets at risk. People say, oh, you got to get rid of liquidity transformation. No, liquidity transformation is what makes the financial system run. You can't always match borrowers and lenders to a perfect duration, but you can manage it such that in times of imbalance, when there's a call for more liquidity or on the result from lenders, that the borrowers are able to give it back. And that was missing in a lot of places here. And these are basic things.
That's really helpful explanation there. As a follow-up to that, so it seems that a lot of the issues you're highlighting with some of the events over the past couple months and over the past years aren't really inherent necessarily to crypto itself. So I'm curious, I know you've remarked in the past that Bitcoin, for example, should be regarded as like a payment mechanism and a store of value, saying that the rise of Bitcoin was driven by inefficiencies in current payment mechanisms. And I'm curious, given these events and their relationship with crypto technology or potentially not with crypto technology, with other issues we have, whether that's influenced your view of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, Jordan, you bring up a good point. And I think it goes back to a hearing in 2018 in front of the Senate Banking Committee, where we were basically bringing to the attention of the Senate Banking Committee and Congress generally the rise of cryptocurrencies, the rise of blockchain technology, and what it meant. And my discussion of Bitcoin there was, I don't know what it's going to be. And in fact, I still don't know what it's going to be, but that advocates said that it was an alternative store of value and an alternative means of what I would say is transferring money, providing for some level of network effect around the globe where people can store value and then transact. Today, I guess we're 5 years on from that, or 4.5. I don't know what the exact date is. It has some of those characteristics. What to me is fascinating about Bitcoin is how many people around the globe own it or own something similar and are connected to this network. Again, what it's going to be in the future, I really don't know. It's also fascinating to me how many people, what I would say is outside the traditional dollar based financial transaction system, own Bitcoin. And my speculation, because I don't know, I can't talk to them, is that many of them do own it for some combination of those reasons. An alternative store of value to their local currency, maybe some investment speculation, and maybe some ability to be plugged into a global network rather than a local network for whatever reason. One of the things I like to do is say, what exactly is happening? What are people doing with this other than the reported price on a day and what that means in terms of investment or speculation or the like?
Very interesting. And given that, these cryptocurrencies are global in nature, but people in their domestic financial economies face different inefficiencies or different frictions in the market. In your opinion, and again, I know this is speculation potentially, would you anticipate that the way that people will use cryptocurrencies will differ significantly by the domestic market that they find themselves in? Or ultimately, do you think that the manner in which they use it will converge to some typical usage going forward?
It's a great question. And I think that despite the fallout and terrible activity and the like, people are still looking at, let's just go to Bitcoin, that the global network created by sort of the consumption of Bitcoin, the holding of Bitcoin, and saying, okay, are we going to have some kind of global retail payments, transfers network that people really use? And then to your question is, are governments actually going to allow that? I think we can all understand that there are some governments that would be more amenable to it and some governments that are unlikely to accept that type of extraterritorial connectivity as part of their overall approach to what I would call, I'll euphemistically refer to as domestic welfare.
So it sounds like we're maybe a long while away from having some sort of global standards regulating crypto.
Yeah, this is not a close analogy, but I think it's an interesting analogy. Go back to the start of mobile phones. There were a bunch of very different domestic technologies. They were regulated on a domestic basis largely, and you couldn't take your US phone to many other countries and use it. The technology wasn't compatible, the regulation and the like. And there were many people who predicted in the mid 90s that any kind of interoperability was going to take decades. Today, you can take your mobile phone just about anywhere and it will work just about anywhere, subject to some of those, what I would say is domestic restrictions on communications and censorship and what you can see. But the basic functionality is pretty global.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's a really great analogy. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed taking your class too, is, there's a lot that we can learn from recent events, even if it doesn't immediately seem very relatable. But I think that was a good way for us to think about it. And, just taking a step back from, deep discussions about crypto, but maybe the role that, you currently play. So in recent years, we are seeing several ex-regulators who have moved on from, say, the public sector to advisory roles in the crypto space. And, you yourself have served as an advisor for Fireblocks, One River Asset Management, Electric Capital. I'm curious, how do you navigate that transition from advocating for specific regulation to then advising companies on how to think through some of these challenging topics and anticipate any potential policy changes?
Yeah, it's a great question because it is a challenge. You are the regulator. You are, as people say, and I think it's an overused phrase, you're the cop on the beat and your job is markets and the stability and the protection of participants, particularly those who are not sophisticated. That's the job. And I do think that you can bring that to the private sector. And to be more specific, for those companies that I advise, and clear to let people know that I have an official role with those companies, but other people seek my advice. I hope and I think that I say the same thing to them that I'm saying to you and that I said when I was in government, which is, you cannot use the technology and the promise of efficiency to circumvent regulations and regulatory purposes. So start with this. You've got to do the current regulatory job at least as well. And then if you're doing it at least as well, regulatory acceptance of your new technology is more likely to happen. Said another way, if you go to a regulator and say, this technology is so great that we don't need to pay attention to these core aspects or even non-core aspects of regulation because the benefits to investors are so great, the regulator's going to say, no, we're not sacrificing even a little bit on protection in order to gain more on efficiency. I'm a big believer that you can pursue protection and efficiency in tandem. And just to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, it is a political cudgel that people try to say that there's a seesaw between investor protection and capital formation and market efficiency. That if you're increasing capital formation and market efficiency, you must be hurting investors. That's an absurd position. Because if you look through history, we have increased all three, dramatically over time. People are much better protected. Markets are much more efficient and capital is much more abundant. Let me give you a great stat. US has 4.4% of the world population. Over 60% of the world's capital is raised in the US. It's because we've pursued all of those. We haven't been locked into, anytime that we're increasing the ability to raise capital, we must be reducing investor protection or increasing risk. No, you can walk and chew gum.
No, that's a very impressive statistic. And I really love the way that you put it, right? That you can have investor protection and greater efficiency. So efficiency shouldn't be an excuse for, circumventing regulation or looking for shortcuts. So thank you so much for that added color there. And, at this point, we've learned so much about crypto. We've learned so much about your job, and we just love to get to know you as an individual more. So we'd love to ask you a couple of fun rapid fire style questions if you're up for it.
Sure.
So what's a common myth about your job?
A common myth about the job at the SEC or the job I have now?
Well, now that you mentioned it, we have to know the SEC answer and then maybe the job that you have now, as an advisor.
Look, I think a common myth about the job at the SEC is that the head of an agency, whether it's the SEC or other agencies, is the person making all the decisions. There are thousands of decisions that need to be made every day, and our markets wouldn't function unless those decisions were being made by the women and men of the SEC on their own authority. I think it's remarkable how many of those decisions they make and really never come to the chair of the SEC or the SEC commissioners as a whole. So you look, the responsibility for those decisions is mine, but I'm not making them.
And how about a myth about your job now that you're an advisor?
Now that I'm an advisor, I guess a myth about the job is, I don't know, that it's smooth. I think, let me say this to all of the people at Wharton and at the law school who are going into advisory jobs. Just remember, when you're an advisor, you're not the principal. And your time, your schedule has to accommodate the needs of the principal. And if you don't like that, become a principal. Like being an advisor, except that the needs, the times, the objectives, and the like are those of the principal.
Excellent advice. Another rapid fire question is, can we ask, do you yourself own any cryptocurrency?
I do not. I do not own any cryptocurrency.
Okay.
And I have not. I do not, and I have not.
Wow. No, it's very interesting. And going back to your time chairing the SEC, we're interested, who did you first call when you found out that you had been nominated for that position?
When I found out I'd been nominated, oh gosh, I think I found out I'd been nominated, as you often do in Washington, when the potential for a nomination gets leaked to the press. You know you might be, and then you hear it in the press, and it's something that you understand because there are people who it's in their interest to provide the press with scoops. It's also an incredible vetting mechanism. Like people read about, hey, Ms. Smith is going to be nominated to run the Department of Energy. And then the public has a chance to weigh in and say, well, whether Ms. Smith has the qualifications or the temperament and the like to do it. So who did I call when I first was considering throwing my name in the ring? Of course, my wife, and say, if we do this, our whole world is going to be turned upside down. So are you okay with that?
I'm guessing she must have said yes because, you did end up pursuing it. So that's great.
Yeah. These types of public jobs, and my job at the SEC was a public job, but it's not as public as many of the jobs that people take on family members and spouses. They are a challenge because your life is disrupted. You're going to be examined in the public eye, and those are things that just come with the territory.
So speaking of your career, what's the greatest career lesson that you've learned?
Oh gosh, greatest career lesson. I'll say this, and I hope I practice it. I don't always. Just a bit of patience. You have fear in life. You have not fear, but just a bit of patience. When you know you can inject value to a negotiation, value to a conversation, value to a project, there's that desire to jump right in. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's actually the right thing to do. Things are going off the rails and you need to jump right in. But when it's a constructive dialogue, picking your timing really well can end up being much more efficient and much more productive than jumping in right away. Allowing people to sort of have a little bit of discussion, listening for what other people are trying to achieve, and using some of their words and objectives in how you present your view on how to go forward. So not patience to the point of being quiet, but patience to the point of picking a good spot. I think I didn't come to that on my own. I got a lot of good advice and good mentoring on how to do that.
No, that's great advice. What have you enjoyed the most about teaching a class at Wharton and at the Carey Law School?
The students.
I knew you were going to say that.
You were in the class. So when everybody is having a discussion, a debate, a little bit of challenge, it's good, right? These are issues that we talked about in this podcast, that we talked about in class, that there's no perfect answer. And when you have one thing we learned is when we have multi-objectives, you can pursue them all, like we talked about. You can actually improve them all, I believe, but you're still choosing, which one you're approving more than the other and methods and the like. And I think students often have better ideas than some of the people I deal with every day.
Going in a slightly different direction to round us out, what's a recent book that you have read that you would recommend to our listeners?
So I'm in the middle of it, or people say they're in the middle, and maybe they're in the beginning. I'm somewhere between the beginning and the middle. Chip Wars.
That's an excellent book. I'm actually in the beginning of that book. Can't claim to be in the middle, but the first chapter is great.
The question is, will I get to the end? But so far, so good.
Awesome. Thanks for the recommendation. And finally, if you had the world's attention for 5 minutes right now, what would you want to say?
For 5 minutes. I'm not going to take 5 minutes. I'm going to take just a few. And that is, I would say, take time every now and then to reflect on how far we have come. I think that there's a great deal of focus on the moment. I call it focus on the spot market. And you can get very emotional about the spot market. That emotion comes down often when you look to history and see how far we've come in many, many places.
Great. Thanks for that very optimistic note for us to end on. Thanks again for joining us today and sharing your insight with us. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Okay, my pleasure. Yeah, terrific. Thank you both.